So let me save this. And now, of course, we can talk about our next topic. All right. So far, we know two flavors. One, if we want to export one value, we just set module exports equal to that value. And then, of course, wherever we want to use it, we just import it, set it equal to some kind of variable. And of course, once we use that variable, we have access to that value. And the second flavor is if we have multiple values, then we simply set module exports equal to an object. And then in that object, we set up the properties. However, there's also another way how we can do that. And essentially, it is called export as you go. And the way it looks like, first, I'm going to set up a new file and I'll call this 6 and I'll call this alternative flavor. Now, again, naming is really up to you since that is the hardest thing in programming. And then I'm going to come up with one array and I'm going to call this items, and that will be equal to item 1 and item number 2. And then I'll set up a object and I'll say const person is equal to a object. And in there, surprise, surprise, we'll go with name property and set it equal to Bob. And I'm purposely adding multiple data types just so you don't think that we can only export variables or functions. And in here, we have two options. Either where we are setting up the value, in this case, items, I simply go with module exports and then whatever is the name. And of course, in this case, I'm going to keep the items. But notice the syntax where instead of going with const items, I right away go with module.exports. Or if you are a true rebel, you can do something like this: module exports, set up the property, for example, single person, and set it equal to your person object. Why we're able to do that? Because if you remember in the previous video, when we console logged module exports, it was an object, right? So what are we doing here? We're setting up a property on that object and set it equal to an array. And here I set up another property and just set it equal to a person. Keep in mind, of course, I can still write simply module exports and then the person. But since you might sometimes see this type of syntax as well, I wanted to cover that. And now, of course, we save alternative flavor JS. And you're probably not going to be surprised that if we navigate to app.js, and in this case, I will call this data because I'm getting a object, and on that object, I have two properties, and I need to come up with some kind of name. Now, as always, this name is really up to you. You can call it Shake and Bake. You can call it Uncle Bobby, whatever you'd want. In my case, I'm going to go with generic data. We go with require. Again, we're looking for the file by the name of alternative flavor. And in this case, I'm not going to do anything with it apart from console logging. And if I navigate back to my integrated terminal, again, run the node app.js, there it is. Of course, now I have the items as well as the single person. Now, please keep in mind one thing, where this syntax, whether the first line or line number 6, at the end of the day, that's exactly the same like we're doing over here. Yes, the syntax is a bit different, but at the end of the day, you just make these values available somewhere else in your code. Now, just because I prefer this type of syntax, most likely throughout the course, you'll see this approach. But if you prefer this one instead, be my guest. At the end of the day, it is your application and you're the one who is going to be maintaining it. And before we move on to built-in modules as well as third-party modules, let me throw you a mind grenade. And I'm going to start by removing this console log in the app.js, like so. And I'm going to create a new file with the same exact name, a mind grenade. As always, if you would like to call this differently, that's totally your option. And I'm going to go with mind grenade, like so, and JS. And in this file, I'll create some basic functionality. And by the way, let me save app.js. So let's go with const num1 is equal to 5, and then const num2 is equal to 10. Of course, there has to be a function that adds these values, as always with every tutorial. So we'll go with add values. Just for the sake of it, I'm just going to go with good old function keyword and the old setup, meaning not the arrow function syntax. And simply here we'll go with template string. The sum is colon, and then of course let's go for template literal, and we'll say num1 plus num2. And instead of setting up the exports, I'll simply invoke add values. And now I'll throw you that mind grenade that I was talking about, where in the app.js, I'm not gonna assign it to anything. I'll simply write require, and then we'll go with mind grenade. And now let me comment out these three, since at the moment they'll just overpopulate the console. And again, let's run node and app.js. And once we run our code, we can clearly see in the console something pretty interesting, where we have a log of the sum is 15. So what's happening over here? Well, when we are setting up everything, if we have a function inside of the module that we invoke, yes, that code will run, even though we didn't assign it to a variable, as you can see clearly here, and we didn't invoke that variable. And before we go any further, let me mention three things. First, it's not unique. You can also do that in ES6 modules. And if you took my vanilla JavaScript course, you know that we use that functionality. Number two, yes, throughout the course here and there, we will use this particular setup. Now, it's going to be with third-party modules. And of course, once we get there, I will remind you about this setup. So that's how it works. And third, I wouldn't suggest losing your sleep over it. Just please remember that when you import a module, you actually invoke it. And this is really going into weeds, but the reason why that happens is because this code is not just exported on its own. When the node exports this, it actually wraps it in the function. So that's why when you require it, yeah, you do invoke the code if you have some kind of function that actually is executed here. Keep that in mind. I'm not talking about exporting something. I'm talking about executing function here and there. And of course, in this case, you need to use the imagination that we'll do something way more useful than this. At this point, you're looking at it, okay, I could have just set up that function in the app.js, and you're 100% correct. This is the place where you definitely need to use your imagination, where, of course, the functionality we'll use it for is going to be way more complex. But the idea is going to be similar, where we'll just